You'll find this also talked about on in the crash course. There's some simple layer cake versus marble cake examples. It's a very classic. You'll see it all the time as an example of the change in federalism from the original intent to modern society. And that's what we're going to talk about here, from dual to cooperative federalism. Intergovernmental between the governments. Relations reflect two major changes in American federalism, both related to the shift towards national dominance discussed earlier. And again, that's from the first part will be from implied powers, especially the Commerce Clause, really expanded the federal government. The first major change has been a gradual shift in the nature of power sharing between the national and state. The second has been the rise of fiscal federalism, an elaborate array of federal grants and aid to the states and localities. Okay. One way to understand the changes in American federalism is to contrast two types, dual and cooperative. Each type represents a different way of dividing power and responsibility between the national and state governments. In dual federalism, the national government and the states remain supreme within their own spheres. The national government is responsible for some policies, the states for others. For example, the national government has exclusive control over foreign and military power, the postal system, monetary policy, that's money in circulation, coining money. States have exclusive control over schools, law enforcement, road building. In dual federalism, then, the powers and policy assignments of the two layers of government are distinct, like a layer cake. Proponents of dual federalism generally believe that the powers of the national government should be interpreted narrowly. So you have a state government, which is reserved, and then you have a separated national, which is enumerated, which is, of course, I'm going to run out of room there. National, they're separate. They're side by side, like a layer cake. So this is the chocolate, this is the vanilla. They're separate from each other. The state is not above the national is not above the state. They're operating separate of each other. That is not what we have right now. We had that at one point in this country, but not anymore. In cooperative federalism, the national government and the states share powers and policy assignments. This type of federalism is like a marble cake, with responsibilities of the two levels of government mingled and clear distinctions between them blurred. Thus, for example, after the terrorist attack on September 11th, the national government asked state and local governments to investigate suspected terrorists, and both national and state public health officials dealt with the threat caused by anthrax in Florida, New York, and D.C. That was a while ago, too. Initially, before the national government began to assert its dominance, the U.S. federal system leaned towards dual federalism. Today, however, most politicians and political scientists would describe the system as one of cooperative. From the beginning, a neat separation into purely state and purely national responsibilities did not characterize American federalism. A look at the area of education, which is usually thought of as being mainly state and local responsibilities, illustrates this point and also shows the movement towards cooperative. I think it should be did. Well, let's see here. Governing under the Articles of Confederation, Congress set aside land in the Northwest Territory to be used for public schools. During the Civil War, the national government adopted a policy to create land-grant colleges. In the 50s and 60s, the national government began supporting public elementary and secondary education. In 58, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, largely in response to Soviet success in the space race, Sputnik. The act provided federal grants and loans for college students, as well as financial support for elementary and secondary education in science and foreign languages. In 65, Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provided federal aid to numerous schools. Although these policies expanded the national government's role in education, they were not a sharp break with the past. Okay, so I see what they're saying here. There always had been some, well, always might be a stretch, but there had been prior to modern day some lack of separation. It was never purely separate. Today, the federal government's presence is felt in every schoolhouse. So in the past, yes, they gave money, they gave grants, they made some laws, but modern times it's a little more complex. Federal courts have ordered local schools to implement elaborate desegregation plans and have placed constraints on school prayers. I think that's the courts, actually. Desegregation would be the schools. Segregation would be based on race, skin color. Almost all school districts receive some federal assistance. To do so, they must comply with federal rules and regulations. For example, they must maintain desegregated and non-discriminatory programs. We can argue whether that really happens, by the way. The No Child Left Behind Act of 01 established standards of performance along with sanctions, including loss of federal aid for schools failing to meet its standards. This law was replaced by Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, which modified but did not eliminate provisions related to standardized tests and shifted accountability to the states. If you want to know why you're tested so much and why elementary, they're tested so much, it's because the state has laws. State of Michigan has laws about testing. They make those laws for schools in order to comply with these federal laws, because if they don't, we lose federal money, federal funding. So the states could say no, we don't actually have to follow it. It's a reserve power, but we want the money and we want the funding. We need it for a variety of projects. So we, as well as every other state, you can Google if anybody's actually forfeited the money. There was one out. I want to say Utah might have wanted to, but I don't know if they did. So states follow along, and all states are following along with this testing. Right now, though, as I talk about this, COVID has put a difference of opinion on whether or not with standardized testing, if we're doing it right. Major events lead to change. So we'll see if the COVID outbreak and pandemic of this year will lead to changes in the enforcement of these laws and maybe Congress changing the law. We'll see. The federal government also plays a crucial role in higher education. First, it is the primary source of financial aid to more than 50 million post-secondary students each year, college students. Nearly 3/4 of full-time undergraduates receive some form of financial aid from the federal government. The federal government also provides several $1 billion of direct grants to colleges and universities across the nation. Billions more in federal funds support research and training in certain areas, especially science and engineering, which receive about $52 billion a year. The libraries, laboratories, and buildings in most colleges and universities have benefited from federal government grants. And we'll talk about later, if you think, wow, that's a lot of money, is it wasteful? You'll have to go through each one and ask yourself, is this a program that benefits the U.S. and who does it benefit, and does it have lasting benefits? And nitpick all of that, whether or not you think it's a good use of money. Highways are another example of the movement towards cooperative federalism. In an earlier era, states and cities were largely responsible for building roads, although the Constitution does authorize Congress to construct post roads. 1956, Congress initiated the building of the interstate highway system, a joint federal-state project, and specified how the costs and the funds to pay for them would be shared. This is another example. The Cold War was the major event that helped push the U.S. to being receptive to this interstate highway system. Eisenhower argued it was good for moving military equipment, but really It was also a justification to create what they saw as much needed interstate highway across this country. You will find that over and over again. Times of war, times of great events leads to being able to persuade change at the federal and state levels. And in this, the federal it's a relationship between national and state governments. You still see this. You'll see that roads are being built. Maybe the federal government will, Department of Transportation will fund 50%, but then the state has to find the other 50% of the funding. That happens often. You also see at local level, local government has to fund some of it, and then the state will step in and fund others, the rest of it. The principal basis for cooperative federalism is shared programs such as education and transportation that are mainly state responsibilities. For hundreds of programs, cooperative federalism involves the following: shared costs. Cities and states can receive federal money for airport construction, sewage treatment, youth programs, and many other programs, but only if they pay part of the bill. So we have to pay, state pays some, federal will pay a part of it. Federal guidance. Many federal grants to states and cities come with strings attached. For example, Congress spends billions of dollars to support state highway construction, but to get their share, states must adopt and enforce limits on the legal drinking age. That happened decades ago. Moving the legal drinking age from 18 to 21 was required to get transportation money. Same with changing the driving under the influence or while intoxicated, whatever one that is, from 0.1 to 0.08. That's a reserved power. The state has a right to make its laws about driving, but if you want federal funding for transportation, for roads, you're going to have to follow the federal guidelines. You see this also in our school cafeterias. Federal government is footing all the bills right now for the cafeteria for eating, but usually does it for free and reduced lunch. If a student qualifies based on family income for the federal or the national government to pay for their lunch and breakfast, the federal government will pay for it. But the school then has to follow the guidelines of what food is served in our school cafeterias. So there's quite a bit of strings attached with federal money. Shared administration. State and local officials implement federal policies, but they have administrative powers of their own. U.S. Department of Labor for job training, money, latitude for, states have administer the money and have considerable latitude in spending it. An example of this one, too, is bridge cards or food stamps, as well as welfare programs and Medicaid programs for low-income families. If a person qualifies for any of that, they go to the state welfare program and the state workers, but the state workers are using federal guidelines and federal money, as well as state guidelines and state money at the exact same time. That's a important component of cooperative federalism. Some money is coming from the federal government. Some of the money for the programs are coming from the state government. And the state has to follow rules in order to get the federal money. The cooperation between the national government and state governments is such an established feature of American federalism that it persists even when the two levels of government are in conflict on certain matters. For example, officials in a number of states challenged in court the health care bill Congress passed in 2010. It's Obamacare, Affordable Care Act. Nevertheless, most implemented the act and cooperated well with Washington on other policies. I'd also say many of the parts of the Affordable Care Act that people liked were followed by the states pretty easily. Michigan expanded Medicaid. Many states expanded Medicaid. Not all. The issue that usually you see in the news that people have issue with is the mandate, the requirement to buy health insurance. But there was way more to the Affordable Care Act than that. The states are responsible for most public policies dealing with social, family, and moral issues. The Constitution does not give the national government the power to pass laws that directly regulate drinking age, marriage, divorce, speed limits. These policy prerogatives choices belong to the states. They become national issues, however, when aggrieved or angry groups take their cases to Congress or the federal courts in an attempt to use the power of the national government to influence states or to convince federal courts to find a state's policy unconstitutional. Good example of this process is the federal requirement that states raise their drinking age to 21 in order to receive highway funds. Candy Leichner, a Californian whose 13-year-old daughter was killed by a drunk driver, formed Mothers Against Drunk Driving in 1980. That's an interest group, right? They're looking for the government to do this. After an intense lobbying campaign by MAD, Congress passed a law withholding federal highway funds from any state that did not raise its drinking age to 21. Today, 21 is the legal drinking age in every state. Drinking laws, though, are diverse. Who can sell liquor, open carry law. There's a lot of diversity within states on these rules. Taxation of liquors, different cost different amounts for alcohol in different states, etc. There is a lot of diversity there, but this 21 age was because of this interest group lobbying. You should remember what lobbying is. The federal government to put strings attached to funding for transportation. This is a good example of how knowing all the other chapters are going to make a difference. Okay. Devolution or devolution, I'm not sure how they say that. The shift towards greater power and responsibility for the national government has not gone unchallenged. Political party goals have played a role in the debate. For most of the 20th century, Democrats supported increasing the power of the federal government in order to advance national policies in areas ranging from child labor laws and education to Social Security and health care. Republicans, in contrast, generally oppose these policies and favor states taking responsibility for such issues. They often articulated their opposition to increased federal power in terms of defense of state authority in a federal system. However, when Ronald Reagan tried to reduce the role of national government in domestic programs and return responsibility to the states, few officials at either the state or national levels agreed with him. Despite their objections, Reagan's opposition to federal spending on domestic programs, together with the huge federal deficits of the 80s, spending more money than they took in, forced Congress to reduce federal funds for state and local governments. In 94 elections, Republicans captured Congress the first time in 40 years that they had majorities in both houses. Their rhetoric centered on devolution, the transferring responsibility for policies from the federal government to state and local government. They followed their rhetoric with action by, for example, repealing federal speed limits, allowing states more latitude in dealing with welfare policy, and making it more difficult for state prisoners to seek relief in federal courts. Soon, however, Republicans became less concerned with abstract principles of devolution and more concerned with adopting a pragmatic, practical approach to federalism in achieving their goals. They found turning to the federal government and restricting state power the most effective way to achieve a wide range of policy objectives, including loosening economic environmental regulations, controlling immigration, setting health insurance standards, restricting the expansion of government-financed healthcare coverage, stiffening penalties for criminals, extending federal criminal penalties, and tracking child support violators. Continuing with this more practical approach, that's an opinion, by the way, during the presidency of George W., Republicans passed a law removing most class action lawsuits from state courts. Most significantly, they passed No Child Left Behind, the largest expansion of the federal role in education since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and a policy that has allowed more federal intrusion into a state domain than almost any other in U.S. history. Many states have complained loudly about the problems and costs of implementing the legislation. In this decade, some political leaders, especially those associated with Tea Party movement, which doesn't exist anymore, have called not only for a smaller national government in general, but also for devolving the principal responsibility for policies such as healthcare and income security to the states. Most Americans, however, embrace a pragmatic view of governmental responsibilities. They see the national government as more capable than the states in handling some matters. For example, managing the economy, ensuring access to health care, safety of food and drugs, preserving the environment, and providing income security for elderly. They see state and local governments as better at handling matters like crime and education. Okay, be careful about these political arguments. Often it's not cutting funding, it's not cutting the money, it's about who's in control of the money. So, for example, a very conservative movement under Betsy DeVos, Department of Education, is they don't want to cut funding and make private schools. They want governments to give money to school, but they want it to be a private program. It is true, though, that DeVos tried to cut funding for federal programs in this idea of federal grants. She was not successful, though. Congress did not cut that funding. So there was a move to cut funding for Great Lakes under the Trump budget. But again, Congress said, no, we're going to fund this program for the Great Lakes. A Republican like Fred Upton, Republican like Bill Huizenga, both reps, they live in Michigan. They represent Michigan. They don't want to see that funding cut. It's not so simple as, oh, I want less national government. Let's turn it all over to the states. Don't fall for that. It really depends on what the program is. The fight over federal funding and federal control of some programs has to do with whether or not the state wants to do it differently. So if you agree with the federal government, you have no problem with the federal government running the program. If you don't like what the federal government's doing, you want the state to run it. And both liberals and conservatives come across this problem, depending often on who is president. So there's a lot more involved in this on your political views than just your view of the Constitution. And I will leave that part there and do a separate one for fiscal federalism.